The mistake that's made, and Richard Dawkins pushed this, is that God and science compete as explanations. So you have to choose between them. And Hawking pushes that even further, and I could never understand that. Why do you offer people a choice? You either believe in God or science, but not both. And then it occurred to me that they're making two profound mistakes. The first one is that they've got the wrong concept of God. Now, that didn't strike me for many years. You see, when I was young, which is a very long time ago, and I used the word God in public in Ireland, everybody knew I was talking about the creator God of the Bible, who sustains the universe, but not now. People like Stephen Hawking, when I use the word God, they think of something like a Greek deity, or Zeus, or something like this. And they automatically assume that you're thinking of a god of the gaps. I can't explain lightning, so I invent a god. When you do some atmospheric physics, that god disappears. And the most important thing to realize, that the God of the Bible is not a god of the gaps. I don't know whether you've ever noticed the first sentence in the Bible. In the beginning, God created the bits of the universe we don't yet understand. No? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and that linguistically is a merism. It means everything. The bits we do understand and the bits we don't understand. Now, come back to Newton. Why did he write in the preface to Principia Mathematica, the most famous book in the history of science? I hope this book persuades thinking people to believe in a deity, because the more he understood of how it worked, the more he admired the genius of the God that did it that way. That's the way your mind works. If you studied engineering, you can understand a turbofan jet much better than I can. If you understand art, you can follow the details of a Rembrandt painting better than I can. The more you understand, the more you admire the genius. And that is just so important. So Newton's faith, and my faith indeed in God, increases because the heavens are constantly and increasingly in detail declaring his glory. That's actually the way it works. But then there's the other side, and that is this. The God explanation is not the same as the science explanation. Let me illustrate it very briefly, if I may. Why is the water boiling? Well, because heat energy from the gas burner is being conducted through the base of the kettle, agitating the molecules, and it's boiling. Okay? It's actually boiling because I'm desperate for a cup of tea. Now you're laughing. Now what does your laughter tell me? You see, it's a false apposition because both explanations are correct. Now think about that. This is very simple. I find kids can understand it, but many professors cannot. And I'll explain that in a moment. You see, the scientific explanation is telling you how it works. But I have also given a personal explanation in terms of human volition. I want a cup of tea. Now think about it. Which is the more important of those two? Well, people have been enjoying tea for thousands of years before they knew about equations of heat. Isn't that so? Those explanations don't conflict. They don't compete. They complement. And I sometimes put it to people and say, look, God no more competes with real science as an explanation of the universe than Henry Ford competes with the basic laws of physics and the law of internal combustion as an explanation for the motor car. You need both. And that is such a simple idea. Whether you're a scientist or not, you can point out explanation comes at different levels. But some of these people will explicitly say the why question is not valid. I've heard Dawkins say that publicly. Well, we do ask it still. And it's a very important question. And I think if we begin to grasp that, it takes the heat out of a lot of things.
Could you repeat that?
About the heat?
You said a little bit ago that the question, has science buried God? No, but science may well bury atheism.
Yes.
I want to write a very popular level book about that in general, because just science, from what I know, I'm convinced that if a fair-minded person reads those chapters just in my book, Miracles, they've got to be convinced that the only rational explanation for anything is that there is a God. I'm convinced of it. We can't prove it. But when you say...
Well, not in the mathematical sense you can't, but you can prove it in the ordinary sense of giving strong evidence for it.
Okay, but what I meant was obviously not in the mathematical sense, because you're the mathematician. So what I mean is that if you are serious about determining whether there is a God, if anything, it does seem to me that science can either take... The farthest science can take you is to... in the direction of atheism, is I don't know. In other words, pure science can only take you to agnosticism. It can never take you to atheism. It's not possible.
I think that's correct. The very interesting thing, you framed the question, and I ought to attempt to answer it. Why do I think that science can bury atheism? It's because science can be done. That may seem a very simple statement to you, but it is an amazing thing. How is it that a mathematician thinking in her head in here and comes up with equations and they appear to apply to the universe out there, how does that work? Now, Eugen Wigner won the Nobel Prize for Physics, and he talks about the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics. We don't deserve it, it's a miracle. Well, he's wrong. It's only unreasonable if you start by believing atheism. But if you start by believing that there's a rational intelligence behind the universe, then doing science is reasonable. What am I saying? I'm saying that the Christian has a rationale for doing science, which brings me back to the rise of science. But let me come now to the atheist position, and I am fortunate to have many atheist friends, and I raise these questions with them. And they sometimes say to me, why are you not an atheist? And they expect me to say, because I'm a Christian. I sometimes do say that, because it's part of the reason. But if they're scientists, I say, because I'm a scientist. If you'll allow a mathematician to be a scientist. And they say, how is that possible? Well, tell me, I say, what do you do science with? And I point up here to make it fairly obvious. And most of them say, well, I do it with my... And they're about to say mind when they realize it's not politically correct to believe in the mind. There's only the brain. That is a common view. You are your brain. So I let that sit for a minute. I say, okay, you do science with your brain. Tell me about your brain with which you do science. What do you really believe about it? Give me a short history of the brain. Oh, they say that's relatively easy because the brain is the end product of a mindless, unguided process. And I look at them and I sometimes smile and I say, and you trust it? Be honest with me. If you knew that the computer you use every day in your lab was the end product of a mindless, unguided process, would you trust it? And I always force an answer. And I've asked dozens of world-famous scientists, and every single one of them has said no. I see you have a problem then. Here, you're doing science, and I'm asking you for a rational justification of your faith. Now, this is hugely important, and you may want to unpack this. We've been miseducated by atheists to think there's science there and there's faith here. Now, faith is a dangerous word in that context because it has two meanings. One is the Christian faith, the Jewish faith, and so on. The other is your subjective faith. And so the impression the culture get is science doesn't involve faith. Christianity does. That is very dangerously wrong. Science involves faith. Simply, you don't do science unless you believe it can be done. More precisely, you don't do it unless you believe the universe is at least in part rationally intelligible. You've got to believe that in order to do science. But now the deep and important question is, why do you believe that as an atheist? If the thing you're doing science with is something you wouldn't trust. In other words, what I'm suggesting to you is very simple. It's that atheism, followed to its logical conclusion, destroys rationality. And they look at me sometimes and they say, where did you get that argument from? I said, you'll never guess. Where did you get it from? I say, Charles Darwin, actually. What? Yes, I say, he wrote a letter once where he said, I'm troubled by the awful thought that the mind, which I believe, or the brain, has come together by natural processes. What would there be in a monkey's mind if you can even talk about it? And Lewis saw this years ago brilliantly in his book on miracles. He said, no argument can be valid that undermines rationality. And if we believe that rationality is simply the end product of mindless, unguided natural processes, that is the end, not only of science, but of all meaning. That is what I mean when I say that atheism, in the end, unravels rationality.